This is Runnymede in Surrey, a meadow near the River Thames. And it's remembered for a scene that took place here in the year 1215. A group of noblemen, Norman barons, forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It set down the rights of the barons. It listed all the things that John couldn't do. For the first time since the conquest, someone had set a limit on the power of kings. The signing of Magna Carta was in 1215. And one of the things we've got to get used to in this jaunt through history is the sheer amount of time involved. 150 years have passed since the Norman conquest. That's 7 kings on the English throne: William, Henry, Stephen, Henry, Richard, John. Except, of course, they were all Norman. They were French. Their real names were Guillaume, Henri, Stéphane, Henri, Richard, Jean. So, for 150 years, we've still got this gulf between ruler and ruled, Norman and Saxon. But the strange thing is, the struggle for power in those years wasn't between Norman and Saxon. It was within the ranks of the Norman elite, between the king and his barons. Who was in control on the ground in Norman England? In theory, the king gave the barons land and received loyalty in return. But in practice, the barons were always hustling for advantage. From the early days of the conquest, barons had risen in rebellion. The first to do so was a certain Roger Fitzosborne of Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight. You can see the temptation. It's like that children's game, I'm the king of the castle. Whoever controlled Carisbrooke controlled the Isle of Wight. Fitzosborne had knights, he had foot soldiers loyal to him. He was basically the king here in all but name. And so he simply decided to withdraw his allegiance to William the Conqueror, to get on with the business of ruling his island. In no time, of course, William came and besieged Carisbrooke and stripped Fitzosborne of his land. But it set a pattern that was repeated again and again under every Norman king. They spent their whole time keeping the barons in check. This is Scarborough Castle, overlooking the North Sea. And this weekend it's overrun with reenactors who are telling the story of King John, the king forced to sign the Magna Carta. In the reign of King John, tensions between the king and the barons reached a climax. Basically, John, like any Norman king, was constantly on the move. Royal messengers would ride ahead, alerting the next baron the king was on his way. And for the baron, it was meant to be a great honor. The reality was, it was a complete nightmare. You had all these extra mouths to feed, the king's soldiers and his knights and his servants and his clerks and all the hangers-on of the court. To entertain the king was cripplingly expensive. The barons put up with royal visits because they gained from the king's favor his patronage. Kings had the right to arrange noble marriages. They had the right to approve when a nobleman's son inherited his father's estates. They granted barons gifts of titles and land. That's if a king got it right. In Worcester Cathedral is the tomb of King John. He was a king who got it wrong. John's been remembered as a bad king. He was certainly a bad man. He strangled his nephew Arthur with his bare hands. He was cruel, he was greedy. But frankly, all the Norman kings were cruel and greedy. What made John a bad king was that he failed as a politician. He misused the power of patronage, and he lost the trust of the barons. John didn't reward barons for loyal service. Instead, he kept them in check with threats and blackmail. He took noblemen's sons as hostages. He abused his power as a matchmaker. He forced the nobles into marriages they didn't want. If they refused, he'd fine them. If they couldn't pay, he moved in and claimed their estates. At last, the barons had had enough. They rose in rebellion, And at Runnymede, they forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, a charter protecting what they called their ancient freedoms. In the centuries that followed, people remembered the Magna Carta as the first document to protect us all from the power of tyrannical kings. We can't be arrested without good reason. That's in the Magna Carta. We have the right to a fair trial. That's in the Magna Carta. The fact is, at the time, those rights were only for the barons. They weren't for us. They weren't for ordinary people. But even so, Magna Carta is still important because it helped to establish the rule of law. In signing that document, John was forced to accept that the power of the law was greater than the power of the sword. Now, no one was above the law, not even the king. And that rule of law protects us to this day.